Hi, this is Cary Hopkins Eyles, Deputy Director for ICU DDR. Welcome to Module 3, Core Counseling Skills as part of Basic Counseling Skills for Addiction Professionals. So today we'll be focusing on some of the most critical counseling skills: reflective listening, asking open-ended questions, affirming, summarizing, and rolling with resistance. Those skills are essential to all types and models of counseling, whether you're doing an assessment, individual counseling, group counseling, family engagement, or working with those with co-occurring disorders. They're relevant across all stages of change, and although some of these skills are usually associated with motivational enhancement approaches, they're useful no matter what specific theory or practice you might use. So please look at Module 3, Goals and Objective, in your manual. By the time we finish this module, I hope you'll be able to explain the concepts and types of reflective listening and demonstrate beginning skills in reflective listening, explain and demonstrate asking open-ended questions, explain and demonstrate affirming, explain and demonstrate summarizing, and explain and demonstrate ways of rolling with resistance. Remember that one of the principles of working with clients with substance use disorders was listen, listen, listen. We all think we know what it means to listen. We listen to people every day. However, in the context of counseling skills or even relationships, listening is actually a complex skill and needs to be practiced. Even experienced counselors don't always get it right. There are many things that can get in the way of listening. For example, instead of listening to a sender's entire message, many receivers start thinking about their own upcoming replies or are too quick to apply interpretations to both verbal and nonverbal behaviors. These types of thoughts create barriers in the communication process and can lead to a misunderstanding of the message. So, some possible barriers to listening include emotional indifference or reactivity, thinking about how to respond while the speaker is still speaking, paying attention to something else in the environment, dwelling on preconceived attitudes or biases, thinking about something in our own lives, daydreaming, judging the speaker's actions or thoughts. We're going to be talking about reflective listening, which is an active form of listening. Reflective listening involves making a reasonable guess about what the client means and rephrasing the client's statement to reflect what the counselor thinks he or she has heard, giving the client a chance to clarify when necessary. Reflective listening is crucial to the client-counselor relationship as it reduces the likelihood of resistance, encourages the client to talk, communicates respect and empathy, solidifies the helping relationship, and reinforces the client's motivation for change. Reflective listening requires the counselor to think reflectively. A crucial aspect of thinking reflectively is understanding that people frequently make assumptions about what others mean when they talk. The process is not always conscious, and reflecting back to the client is a way of confirming what the client means rather than assuming it. True reflective listening requires paying attention to the client's verbal and nonverbal responses and their possible meanings, understanding of the communication style of the client's culture, forming simple reflections that have meaning to the client, and maintaining flexibility and understanding the client's behavior. There are 3 different types of reflective listening: simple, amplified, and double-sided reflection. We'll start with simple reflection. Simple reflection, or paraphrasing, is the most basic type of reflection. Simple reflection involves listening for content and observing affect. Reflects the client's statements back to him in a simple, neutral form without just repeating the client's words verbatim. It's delivered as a statement rather than a question, and it's helpful when establishing rapport. Example of a simple reflection would be statements like these. Client, I don't plan to quit shooting up anytime soon. Counselor, you can't see yourself not using right now. Client, as if that weren't enough, my wife and I aren't getting along at all these days. Counselor, you're having some problems in your marriage right now too. Let's look at some more examples. Client, I'm starting to feel better now that I'm in treatment, but I can't help wondering whether my boss will take me back after I get out of treatment. Counselor, so you have mixed feelings. You're feeling better physically, but worried about whether or not you'll still have a job when you get discharged. Client, I wouldn't be in this situation if my wife hadn't stupidly called my boss. Counselor, you're pretty angry at your wife right now. Simple reflection acknowledges and validates what the client has said and lets the client know that the counselor is attentive and understands what the client is attempting to communicate. It also helps keep the client focused and encourages elaboration. Simple reflection is a particularly good tool for early engagement when the counselor and the client are getting to know each other and are building trust. Before we move on to the next type of reflection, this would be a time where you would have your students practice. So one would be you'd have a talker and you'd have a listener. So you can look at this in your manual as a practice. Next, we'll consider amplified reflection. Amplified reflection adds to simple reflection by reflecting the client's statement in an expanded but not sarcastic form. It may help the client think about what he or she is saying and can move the client towards positive change rather than resistance. It's important that an amplified reflection is done in a way that avoids making the client feel worse. So, for example, a client may say, I don't know why my wife is so worried about this. I don't smoke bang any more than any of my friends. An amplified, slightly exaggerated reflection might be, so there's absolutely no reason for your wife to be worried. This reflection could cause the client to consider whether there is absolutely no reason for her to worry and respond, well, I didn't say absolutely no reason. Such a response opens the door for the counselor to explore further. For example, so there may be some reason for her to be worried? What legitimate reason to worry do you think she might have? Here's another example. A client may say, I know I've made mistakes, but all this stuff you're making me do is ridiculous. The counselor could respond, you don't agree with any of what they're making you do. This might prompt the client to further respond and, well, I know I need to do some of these things to make it right. I'm just really frustrated with all these meetings. And one more example. Client, you have to realize that I've been with the same group of friends for over 10 years. I've known them longer than I've known my wife. So you might say as the counselor, so you value your friendships more than your family. Client, no, I didn't mean that. My family is really important to me. The last type of reflective listening is double-sided. Double-sided reflection acknowledges what the client has said, but also states contrary things he or she has said in the past. This type of reflection requires the use of information the client has offered previously, although perhaps not in the same meeting. It may work best, or at least be easiest, later in the counseling relationship when the counselor has more history to draw from. Counselors should have an established rapport with the client prior to using this intervention. Here's an example. Client, maybe I should give up completely, but I'm not going to do that. Counselor, on the one hand, you see there are some real problems here, but quitting entirely is not what you want to do. On the other hand, you've said you're worried about the effects of your use on your children. It must be confusing for you. Double-sided reflection is basically a yes, but what about approach. Another example, my family means everything to me. Counselor, I'm a little confused here. On one hand, you're saying your family means everything to you, but on the other hand, you're not willing to give up relationships with friends who may be a threat to your recovery. So we want to be careful when we're using these reflections. That, as mentioned earlier, we don't want it to be sarcastic. We don't want it to be aggressive. We want to be sincere. And there's a nice small group exercise you can practice here with your students. You can use your resources. So, to summarize, you have your simple reflection, basically paraphrasing, amplified, reflecting client's statement in an expanded and not sarcastic form, and double-sided, reflecting a client's statement but adding something the client has said that's contrary to the first statement. So we'll be talking about and learning a number of new skills in this module, but perhaps none will be quite as useful as reflective listening. Reflective listening is a core skill you have to use in every encounter and with any model of treatment. Counselors must be constantly attentive, and it's hard work. As we go through these, keep thinking about and practicing the 3 kinds of reflective listening in the role play exercises and with one another. Next, we're going to talk about asking questions, specifically using open-ended questions. First, it's important to know there is a downside to asking questions. Counselors often mistake questioning for good listening. Although a counselor may ask questions to learn more about the client, the underlying message sometimes seems to be that the counselor might find the right answer to all the client's problems if enough questions are asked. In fact, intensive questioning can interfere with the spontaneous flow of communication and divert it in the direction of interest of the counselor rather than that of the client. Of course, counselors do need to elicit information from clients the clients may not be eager to share. Asking questions can be an effective way of learning about the client and the client's concerns, but certain guidelines should be followed. Center the questions on the client's concerns. Ask only one question at a time. Avoid shame or blame-oriented questions. And before asking a question, determine whether it's legitimate and therapeutic and how it should be phrased to provide the most effective result. The most effective way to phrase questions is usually to make sure they are open-ended. So, open-ended questions are those that cannot be answered by yes or no, cannot be answered with 1 or 2 words, require explanation, are thought-provoking, are not theoretical, meaning questions that are asked more to make a point than an expectation of an answer, like how many roads must a man walk down before you can call him a man. And sometimes they're not even framed as a question. Instead of asking, when did you last use cocaine, a counselor might say, tell me more about the last time you used cocaine, to elicit more than a date. Of course, open-ended questions are not always the best way to go. Asking a client, tell me about where you live, is not the most efficient way to get a client's address. These are some examples of closed-ended and open-ended questions. So, do you think you use amphetamines too often? They might just say yes or no, as opposed to in what ways are you concerned about your use of amphetamines? Now that we're clear on what open-ended questions are, why use them? There's a number of reasons. Open-ended questions help the counselor understand his or her point of view. They elicit clients' feelings about a given topic or situation. They facilitate dialogue because they cannot be answered with a single word or phrase and don't require a particular response. And they solicit additional information in a neutral way. Open-ended questions also engage the client to do most of the talking. They help the counselor to avoid making prejudgments, and they keep communication moving forward. So now we're going to move into affirmations. Affirming is making a statement about a person that's sincere and positive. Affirming is like complimenting, but it says something about a person that is deeper than your hair looks great. One of the most important effects of affirming is that it is promoting a client's feelings of self-efficacy. And this is a term that was coined by social psychologist Albert Bandura. He basically defined it as a person's belief in his or her ability to succeed in a particular situation. Although a person's beliefs about his or her abilities begin to form in early childhood, they continue to evolve throughout their lifespan and can be influenced. For instance, many people find that someone they admire, such as a mentor, to emulate or to be motivated by, someone they would like to be like. Bandura believed that one critical way in which self-efficacy can be enhanced is through what he called social persuasion. That people can be persuaded to believe that they have the skills and capacities to succeed. Getting verbal encouragement and affirmation from others helps people to overcome self-doubt and enhances their self-efficacy, increasing their confidence and their ability to take action and change behavior. Affirming can strengthen the helping relationship by demonstrating to clients the counselor acknowledges their difficulties and validates their experiences and feelings. In addition, emphasizing clients' experiences that demonstrate strength, success, or power prevents discouragement. Here are some examples. I appreciate how hard it must have been for you to decide to come here. You took a big step. I'm impressed that you were able to say no to your brother this weekend. Or that's a really good suggestion. This would be a fun, affirming group exercise if we were together. I will affirm that I am grateful that all of you are here and listening, and I know that sometimes it's not easy when we're not interactive, but I really respect you spending this time with me. So now we're going to move on to summarizing. Summarizing is distilling the essence of what a client has expressed or what has happened in a counseling session and communicating it back to the client. It's different from simple reflection in that it's not a reflection of a statement, but a summary of a conversation or a counseling session. Summaries help clients by reinforcing what they said, demonstrating that the counselor has been listening carefully, helping them consider their responses and experiences, and preparing them to move forward. A summary that links the client's positive and negative feelings about substance use can also help the client to see his or her ambivalence and any discrepancies between substance use behavior and goals. We'll be talking more about ambivalence and discrepancy in the next module. Summarizing is also a good way to review the previous sessions and end a current counseling session. Summarizing is useful for group sessions as well as individual sessions. It's also a good link between the last session and the current one. And frankly, it can be really good if you need to write a summary of the session in your notes to already be doing it while you're talking with the client. Summarizing can affirm the progress a client or group is making. It can remind clients of any commitments they've made and reinforce homework assignments. For example, a counselor could summarize both a client's report and a session, something like this. We covered a lot of ground today, Richard. We talked about the great success you had in saying no to your brother's offer of cocaine. Although it felt really frustrating at the time, you ended up feeling good about yourself afterwards. Did I get that right? We also talked about some problems you're having with time management, and you agreed to write down a schedule for the next week and see how that works for you. Notice that in the example, the counselor asked, did I get that right when summarizing? It's important that the counselor encourage the client to correct the summary. In this case, for example, Richard might respond, it wasn't frustrating exactly, but I felt kind of guilty because my brother felt bad when I walked away. Summarizing also serves a strategic purpose. In presenting a summary, the counselor can select what information to include and what to minimize or leave out. In this way, he can reinforce the positives and minimize the negatives. For example, Richard may have talked about recovery being just too hard earlier in the session, but the counselor didn't want to remind Richard of that, so they left it out of the summary. Now we're going to talk about rolling with resistance. The concept of rolling with resistance comes from Miller and Rolnick's motivational interviewing material. We're talking about it as a core skill, however, because it's an extremely useful concept and set of skills. It also represents a change in the way we think about client resistance. An historic view of client resistance was that a resistant client was behaving defiantly or was in denial. In response, counselors often use confrontation or argument in response to resistance. The newer and more constructive view is that resistance is simply an indicator of ambivalence, and ambivalence is a normal part of any change process. We'll be talking more about ambivalence moving forward, but for now, a simple definition is mixed feelings. In other words, people often want to change and don't want to change, both at the same time. It's like having an internal tug of war. A good counselor will help the ambivalent client tip the motivational balance. Resistance can also be a signal that the counselor needs to change direction or listen more carefully to the client. So, before we talk about rolling with resistance, what are 4 common types of resistance identified by Milner and Rolnick? So in other words, what do we know that we're sort of going in the wrong direction or that we need to roll with the tide here? Arguing, interrupting, denying, and ignoring. So we've already talked about one of the strategies that Milner and Rolnick recommend for rolling with resistance, reflective listening. It's more difficult for clients to continue to feel resistant when they feel they're being heard and acknowledged. Reflective listening is a very powerful way of diffusing a client's resistance or even anger. The other techniques we'll talk about are shifting focus, agreeing with a twist, reframing, and emphasizing personal choice and control. Rolling with resistance is similar to simply avoiding arguments, but it also offers opportunities to express empathy by remaining non-judgmental and respectful and encouraging the client to talk and stay involved. So let's start with shifting focus. Shifting focus shifts the client's energy and attention away from obstacles and barriers. It's a way of getting around a stuck point to keep the client talking and progressing. Sometimes it's best to simply ignore a client's negative statement. Other times it's important to briefly acknowledge what the client has said and move on. One way of shifting focus is to be very clear about what you're doing and why. For example, the client says, "I can't stop smoking dope when all my friends are doing it." Counselor can say, "You're way ahead of me. We're not ready to talk about that yet. We're exploring your concerns about your grades and whether you'll stay in school." At other times, it may be best to simply move on without explanation. For example, "I know I made a mistake, but all the stuff they're making me do is ridiculous." "You're upset by everything you have to do right now. Can you tell me more about the mistake you think you made?" The next strategy, agreement with a twist, is a subtle strategy that's similar to amplified reflection. The counselor agrees with the client, but with a slight twist or change of direction that propels the discussion forward. For example, using the same client phrase. "I know I made a mistake, but all this stuff they're making me do is ridiculous." All of these expectations are frustrating. You're also anxious to be successful with some things so you can keep moving forward. Reframing offers a new and positive interpretation of negative information provided by the client. It acknowledges the validity of the client's perception, but at the same time offers a new meaning for consideration. For example, "I know I made a mistake, but all this stuff they're making me do is ridiculous." Counselor, "You're not happy about having others have so much control, but so far you've been able to keep up with their expectations and have been quite successful." Education can also be a useful way to use reframing. For example, many heavy drinkers do not believe they have a substance use disorder because they can hold their liquor. When the counselor explains objectively that tolerance is a risk factor and a warning signal, clients' perspectives may shift regarding the meaning of their ability to hold their liquor. Emphasizing personal choice and control can help clients recognize that they are, in fact, making a choice. Clients ultimately do choose a course of action, and this technique simply acknowledges that fact. "I know I made a mistake, but all this stuff they're making me do is ridiculous." Counselor would say, "You don't like what others are asking you to do, but so far you're choosing to follow through with what they're asking. It takes a lot of fortitude to do that." Also, you can see there that there's some affirming in there. Acknowledging the positive choices a client makes also helps build his or her feelings of self-efficacy. And this is also nice because sometimes clients will act like, "Well, I don't really have a choice," but really they do. So even if they tell you, "I don't have a choice because I'll go to jail if I don't do this," that's a choice. They've chosen not to go to jail, and other people don't always make that choice. Okay, so here are some small group exercises. I hope that you'll look at those for your understanding and also to potentially use that when you're teaching it. And we're going to move into intentionality. Counselor intentionality means selecting helping behaviors and specific strategies with a clear purpose and direction in mind. Research links intentionality with positive treatment outcomes. In practice, intentionality means that a counselor plans treatment interventions based on an individual's client situation and needs, including his or her stage of change, level of recovery capital, environmental situation, and so on. It also means that a counselor goes into an individual or group session with a clear objective in mind and does not allow a session to take on its own momentum. Of course, it's important that a counselor is flexible enough to change direction when it's truly warranted, but allowing treatment to meander is not productive. In sum, the intentional counselor is one who learns many helping strategies, continues to accumulate knowledge of human development and related issues, as you're all doing, and offers clients a relationship in which all possibilities can be explored, examined, and evaluated. Our next module, Stages and Strategies for Change, addresses appropriate strategies for a particular stage of change, an example of intentionality in counseling. I hope that you're all enjoying this. This is one of my favorites. This course on basic counseling skills for addiction professionals is the one that we piloted in our mentorship training. So I did this. I was the first trainer for this with people who wanted to learn more about it. And that is something that if you're interested in, that you can find out more information later. I can discuss it with you. And all the best. Talk with you soon.